Good evening, everybody. Quainine Deluisi, Pam Palmater, and I am a Mi'kmaq lawyer, professor, and content creator. I'm also a member of Eel River Bar First Nation, which is part of the larger Mi'kmaq Nation, an unceded and sovereign Mi'kmaqi, and I work in the area of Indigenous issues, focusing on First Nations, and also things like human rights. But tonight, I'm coming to you from the sovereign Mississaugas of Scugog territory, and joining me tonight is one of my favorite people. It's Dr. Cindy Blackstock, and she's from the Gitxsan First Nation that's in BC. And for those of you who don't know her, and I think most people know her by now, she's the head of the First Nation Child and Family Caring Society, and she's also a professor in the School of Social Work at McGill University. Most of you know her as and her team at the First Nation Child and Family Caring Society, and all of the amazing lawyers and spirit bears and a random assortment of other bears. And I think there's even a dino that Cindy has.
Yes, a dino.
This whole team and volunteers and kids and allies have all worked really hard to help fight for justice for First Nation kids in care and their families. And by now you would know that they won their Canadian Human Rights Tribunal case some time ago. The interesting thing is that Cindy used Canada's own internal documents to prove that Canada was racially discriminating against First Nations kids in foster care and their families. In other words, Canada knew that by treating First Nations kids unfairly, that many First Nation kids would be unfairly put into foster care. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining me tonight, Cindy. There are so many questions, but first of all, where are you?
Well, I'm really honored to join you from unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory right today. But I actually just had the great honor of visiting with First Nations folks up in Whitehorse and in Winnipeg. So I'm just feeling really energized by all the wonderful conversations and ideas that people have shared with me.
I know, and like how everyone just loves kids, right?
Yeah.
You think about they're so small, they're so vulnerable in certain circumstances. They need to be surrounded by love and care and protection and comfort. And it's just so great to see so many people come out, whether you're having a fundraising or a gala or a speech or gathering, because they're all doing it for kids. And that's just really, really special. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to have this live session tonight, because you would not believe how many questions I have been getting about the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal compensation order, but also this settlement between the Assembly of First Nations, AFN, and Canada, and what it means. Is it a done deal? How does it relate to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal? And so I thought, the best person to get here to answer those questions would be you. And I don't know if you can answer all of these questions because I've been gathering them up all day. And if you can't, that's cool. But for whichever ones you can, I think the people who are watching would really appreciate clearing up some of the confusion or misinformation, or sometimes even rumors go around about what's happening. And it's important to clarify. But before we get started, it's important that I have to do the disclaimer that neither Cindy and I are providing financial advice, legal advice, medical advice, or even personal advice. We're just doing our best to read everything that we can, to do all the research and provide our interpretation of what's happening. And it's because, we have concerns about some of these things. So for those of you who have not heard about the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal case, we're not going to be going over that in detail today. Cindy and I have done a multitude of podcasts on that. So if you want the details, I'll put links in the description box below, and you can go and listen to all of the details. I think the focus of tonight is really what's going on with this settlement. What does it mean for the Human Rights Tribunal compensation order, and clearing up some of the confusion. So, Cindy, because we're not going into the details, can you just give a quick snapshot about the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal order and the compensation?
Sure. So as everyone knows, the federal government funds public services on reserve. And ever since way even before Confederation, they always shortchanged First Nations folks. We're always getting less and more trauma than everybody else and expected to cope with it. So this was really piling up on the hopes and dreams of kids. And we actually worked for 10 years with the federal government to point out these inequalities and show how they were hurting families and resulting in the removal of kids in care, but also the denial of services through Jordan's principle. Basic things like feeding tubes for kids, or help with children with autism, or, you know, medical transportation, all these things that kids need. First Nations kids were being told no, or you get less. And so we actually filed the case with the Assembly of First Nations back in 2007. And we said this is racial discrimination. And the federal government fought it tooth and nail, as you know, Pam. Like, holy smokes. I didn't even know there was that many levels of court, but we went through them and the kids won every time.
Yes, for the kids.
Yeah. And in 2016, they were ordered, a legal order to stop discriminating. But they didn't do it. And so we've now had 22 non-compliance and procedural orders against the federal government. And so that's a lot of, like,
That's a lot.
Yeah. Like, think about this. If you were breached probation 22 times, you wouldn't be in good shape, right? But they did say that they wanted to kind of negotiate a settlement on both the compensation, which is meant to try and give some measure of justice and recognition to all the children and families who are hurt, and to stop the discrimination from happening, because it's still going on as far as I'm concerned, and to make sure that they don't do this to another generation of kids. So that's the work that we have underway.
Wow. It sounds so simple, but when you just say, like, it's been over a decade, there's like 22, I think you said, non-compliance orders. I mean, you would just think that at the very least, they would comply with what the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal would say. So how does this differ from the settlement agreement right now? I understand there's some one or two class actions, and this settlement agreement is supposed to like wrap everything up together. And there's a lot of questions about that. In fact, Alvin asked, what is this settlement agreement about, and does it cancel out the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal compensation? And he says it's very confusing, and I kind of agree.
I think so too. Like, I'm learning too. So let me tell you what I know here is that under the Canadian Human Rights Act, which is the same law that we filed the human rights case, they can award up to $40,000 for victims. And they did that. Back in 2019, they said this is a worst case scenario. Canada knew what it was doing, and it still didn't fix the problem. So it ordered $40,000. Now, under the Canadian Human Rights Act, you can only go back a year before you filed the complaint. So from 2006 forward, that's where the date 2006 comes in.
Yeah.
So Canada was ordered to pay the money by the tribunal, and Canada said, no, we're not paying any money. And they appealed it to the federal court. And then they lost there. And meanwhile, Canada started saying, well, we actually don't want to pay the Human Rights Tribunal money. We actually want to give these people more money. And we're going to do that by having a class action. And then we'll just kind of absorb the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders and then build more on top of that. Well, the folks that are in the class action are what we call the Motion Group, which is a group of lawyers primarily out of Quebec and Toronto, and then the Assembly of First Nations. So they signed an agreement in principle last December, and it basically said, we're going to settle on $20 billion, right? And we're going to compensate all these people. Now, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
But you know, Pam, there's lots of people out there that was hurt by Canada. And their class action goes back to 1991. So the question was, is that enough money to give the people that already are entitled to 40, they're 40? And when we looked at the final settlement agreement, it turned out that some people will get more, and that's a good thing. But sadly, some kids who are already entitled to 40 would get nothing. The estates of parents that are already entitled to 40 would get nothing. And also the entitlements for all the families and children under Jordan's principle, they're still working out the criteria. So it's really unclear what they're going to get under that. And that caused us some concern, because we thought, you know, like, the job of the Caring Society is to stand up for the people who are left behind. it does. I don't want to take anything away from people who are getting more under the final settlement agreement. That's a good thing. But we certainly don't want to see people, especially children, have something taken away from them. And that's what we're worried is happening here under this final settlement agreement.
Well, and that's a valid concern because effectively they've already won their case.
Yeah.
It's been upheld.
Yeah.
To do otherwise would just be taking money out of the pockets of kids. And that doesn't seem to make very much sense. And it doesn't seem very fair. And what we're trying to do is make sure that kids are treated fairly by all of us. And I'm also glad that you cleared up the 2006 date because a lot of people were asking questions about that. Why did you only pick 2006? But it wasn't that you picked 2006. It's that you were trying to, work with Canada in good faith for a decade. And then the legal rule is that, you can't go back more than a year. So you really had no control over that.
No.
And so good. I'm glad we answered that question. And I guess you've already answered Tanya's question because she wanted to know if Canada has complied with the order to compensate, because she was saying, I haven't seen any payment for my kids. And so obviously the answer is no.
The answer is no. They haven't paid a penny in compensation. And one of the things that's in that final settlement agreement is it said, well, the tribunal has to agree with this final settlement agreement, basically replace its orders with whatever's in this final settlement agreement in order for Canada to start paying the money. And so that's kind of crazy because really Canada should be paying the money now. They're under legal order to pay the money, right? It just feels like they're kind of trying to, delay. And get out of paying. Like, I mean, these people have suffered enough. They should just be cutting these checks, and they're not doing it yet.
Exactly. And it literally makes no sense to me because, and you have to think about every time Canada delays or litigates, is it ever for a good purpose?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's generally not a good purpose. And certainly there's people out there waiting who could benefit from the compensation. In fact, they shouldn't even have to argue about it because they've already won. They've already got this compensation.
That's right. Well, and half of the people entitled to compensation, Pam, and this is important for all your listeners to know, are actually still children. Like we think about the Indian residential schools or the day schools or the 60 Scoop, and those people were hurt as children, but they received their compensation as adults. In this case, over half of them are still children. And so their monies will go into trust. But it really brings into stark relief what we're talking about here, right? Like this was a government that hurt little kids who are still little kids. And that's why it's really important to me that we get this right, that we don't leave little kids behind, that we make sure that we really are honoring them and that we're providing all the victims with all the support that they need.
I think that's a really important point because oftentimes people think, oh, foster care was in the past, because 60 Scoop was in the past or residential schools are in the past. Then that really forgets two things. One, about the intergenerational impacts, and two, that the foster care crisis is literally ongoing. The discrimination is ongoing. The harm is ongoing. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the people who would get compensation, they're actually very little kids.
There could be infants who would get compensation because the end date for the compensation for kids coming into care was April of this year. So you could really have an infant that will do doing it. And this is important for communities to think about too, right? Because, you want to make sure that everyone, when they do turn 18, that they have the supports there so that money doesn't go to a vulnerable young person, maybe who's really traumatized and into addictions, and it can create damage for that person. So how do you prepare supports at a community level for children in your community? Every year, you're going to be supporting people through that process. And that's why also we really have to be very, very supportive and very clear about what is going to happen when the money comes out.
I think that's important. And I don't think that when they do get their compensation, they should have to be subsidizing for all of the programs and services that Canada still doesn't fund at a fair level, which, as I understand, that's part of the Spirit Bear plan to really ask Canada to look at all of the social programs and services, not just child and family services, and make sure kids and families and First Nations are treated fairly across the board. Because the last thing you'd want to do is to, for these kids to get their compensation and then say, oh, well, now I have to pay for clean drinking water.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things. So we want to make sure that we protect them too, and that they maybe have some financial supports about what to do with this money, how you can make this money work for you, so that, they have that kind of advice and guidance around it.
Well, on that one, we've done something. We reached out with First Nations Youth in Care and with the Youth in Care Network of Canada, and we actually created financial literacy videos. So, and actually, I find them good, fam. Like, I mean, I'm not exactly the best mathematician. So, I keep myself, I make sure my bills are paid, but it's always good to have some good financial tips. And so these are really practical things that everyone should know, like how to open up a bank account. What is, how to avoid predatory loans, like payday loans and all the rest of that, all that kind of stuff. And so we've worked with them and did these great kind of videos. We just released them this year. So those are out there, but that's just a small piece of the supports that people will need.
Well, yeah. And, I think about, and I don't know about you, but when I was younger, my family didn't tell me about, financial literacy or anything else. And they probably didn't know it either. We're basically on a piece of paper saying, well, this is how much I get paid and I'm going to pay all these bills. But you don't know the impacts of credit cards and their high interest or predatory loans or any of the other things that once you get in, it's really hard to get out. So I think that's really valuable. And I can't wait. It's available to the public, right? Like I could go watch
it's available to the public. And they're already out there. And they're like the cool kind of things, those infographic stuff.
Yeah.
Visual like me, like it really helps, right? And so
that's really, really good. So Michael wants to know, what is the 40 billion about? Because he hears lots of people talking about the 20 billion. And I think people are confused. Is it 20 billion? Is it 40 billion? What is each aspect of the settlement for?
Yeah, excellent question, Michael. So when we think about compensation, that's for the people who are already hurt.
Okay.
So there's $20 billion that Canada's agreed in this class action to pay in compensation. So that's for the folks who sadly already experienced the harm from Canada. Then the goal is we got to fix this. We got to make sure there aren't more people hurt and they don't do it again. So there's $20 billion for that over a period of 5 years. And we are working now with First Nations and First Nations experts to try and figure out how do we really make the most of that money for kids. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is, this is only a 5-year deal for that 20 billion to fix the problem. Well, what happens in year 6 and 7? That is a big question, because none of us have done this work to just have non-discrimination for our kids for 5 years. Like this last week, I was in these beautiful communities and I saw these beautiful babies. And I thought, when you're 5 or you're 6, you deserve the same kind of help that kids are finally just starting to get in nations right now through Jordan's Principle and for family support services. So that's what the other $20 billion is for, is to fix the problem and to stop it from happening again.
Well, so that's super important. We don't want to just keep settling harm, because you can't undo the harm to kids. You can't undo the harm to families. And you think about babies, like my son and his fiance are going to have a baby in March, and I'm going to be a granny. And the thought of, even my grandkids being taken away, my own kids being taken away, that harm is irreplaceable to not just for the kids, grandkids, but also for the moms and grandmoms and aunties. It's just irreparable damage. And so the compensation even here is small. It's the maximum they could order, but it's really small. And I'm also glad you raised the 5-year deal, because I never thought, what does happen in year 6? Does everything go back to the way it was? Where's the legal obligation for them to continue? And then, thinking off the top of my head, and I know you might not know the answer to this, but if that's the case, how does this affect First Nations who drew down jurisdiction under Bill C-92, the First Nation Child Welfare Law, because we know from Indigenous Services Canada, their affidavits and testimony in different parliamentary and Senate committees were saying, oh, those they won't even get the benefit of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal or Jordan's principle. And that was before this settlement, especially on the long-term reform. So I'm wondering, this is a lot more complicated. And I haven't seen any information sheets that are out there saying, oh, don't worry, C92 First Nations, you're still going to get the same thing. You're going to get the same as everyone else, because it's certainly not that way, at least according to Indigenous Services Canada. And that really concerns me. I'd like to see some answers to that.
Yeah, I think there needs to be a lot of assurances. If you read the C92 Act itself, it doesn't actually obligate Canada to pay a penny.
No.
And that's I think why they were so excited to kind of do the photo op and say woohoo, because there's no financial obligation on them. They did in the agreement in principle for our long-term reform say that they would give them the same level as everyone else as a minimum. But how do you make sure that's actually happening?
Yeah.
And an agreement in principle, as you know, Pam, is non-binding, right? It's kind of like an agenda for something that might be binding.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And, folks like Naomi Metallic and Hadley Friedland, these other brilliant women who are out there doing this work, we'll have to have them in for a conversation about C92, talk about that.
I think that's why it's so important that for things like this on such a global, national level, on such a critical issue, you really got to be reaching out and talking to a larger portion of people about what should be in this, what shouldn't be in this, what are some of the gaps that we didn't think of, right? Because something I might think of, you might not, and vice versa. Something you think of, maybe Naomi Metallic or Hadley wouldn't think of. And so I really think these things really need to have much larger engagement, or at least information.
Well, you know what? And we always knew this in our different diverse First Nations. The one thing we have in common is we knew it took a community to raise a child.
Yeah.
And that's what we're doing here. And even though when we're thinking about how do we set families and communities up for success, it's really about how taking care of that, building that community around the child. And that's why it's so important that we all kind of say, look, I got some of the answers. I don't have all of them. And let's not make this an idea competition. Let's actually do the right thing for kids and bring all the best ideas to the kids.
It just reminds me of something that you've said. Kids know this. Kids know the basics of fairness. They don't think about politics. They don't think about negotiations. You're just like, do we have fairness or not?
Yeah.
And we're not there yet, but this information will help people understand all of this better. And I have another question. It's from Suzanne. Oh, it's kind of two questions, and we may have partially answered it, but she says, didn't Canada say that these children who are compensated with $40,000, didn't Canada say that, don't worry, no one is going to get lower than that? The reason why we want to have a settlement agreement is to make sure that if people suffered greater harms, that they could increase it above 40,000, but 40,000 would be the absolute minimum. That sounds familiar to me. I'm pretty sure I heard federal officials say that. Did you?
Yeah, I heard a lot of politicians actually say that in the government. And with really what they were saying is, well, we're going to class action because we want to give people more, and we want to give more people compensation. And that would be a good thing. Yes. But, it's kind of like when you hear something that sounds really good and then you look at the fine print, right? And we didn't really see the fine print until that agreement was out. And so what we want to make sure here, like I think about this deal, like I don't like to use a Bible reference very often because of all the bad things the Bible did, but I'm thinking of Noah's Ark, Pam. The Noah's Ark story was really good if you were on the ark, but it was really bad if you were left behind. Right. And that's what I think we have to pay attention to, is we have to make sure that, and we're talking about children here and some of their parents and caregivers, we got to make sure that everybody's on that ark.
Yeah, well, exactly. Especially when it comes to, Canada is in the process of allegedly trying to make reparations for generations of genocide. They're supposed to be in this process of reconciliation and making sure that they don't do any any more discrimination. So you would think no one should be left behind. But
Yeah.
I'm starting to see a lot of cracks and a lot of gaps and potential for that to happen. And I think it's just, I'm so glad that you're out there making arguments at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal saying, look, don't forget about this. We can't leave these kids out. These are like bare minimum standards. So Barb, I think Barb was from Facebook. I forgot to write down whether they're from Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Like there were so many questions.
Well, I mean, you're amazing at social media. Like I was on Facebook for a while. I just couldn't keep up. So now all I do is Twitter. But, like I know I'm missing all the kind of good news that happens on kind of Indigenous Facebook. But one day we'll have a bit more time and a bit more savvy on the internet and I'll get back on there.
No, I think you're doing enough now. But the good thing about all social media is you can find out what people really want to know. And not a single one of them asked anything about politics, about jobs, about none of the kind of other stuff that politicians talk about. They're asking these basic questions, which are the key questions.
Yeah, they are.
Yes. Okay. So is this the same Barb? Okay. Oh, no. So Barb wants to know if the First Nations Child and Family Services or Child and Family Caring Society is part of this settlement agreement, as in she wants to know specifically, do you guys have to sign off on the settlement? Like, did you sign off when AFN-Canada did?
Yeah, this is a really good question, Barb. And there's another thing that get confusing. So at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, we're a party, which means we brought the case along with the Assembly of First Nations. So we were there arguing for the compensation. And in fact, the chiefs in Assembly of all the First Nations passed a resolution directing us all to go for the maximum $40,000. So we did that and we defended that order in federal court. And then we thought, okay, that's done. Then Canada needs to start cutting the checks. Over on the side, Canada signed an agreement with the class action lawyers and with AFN. That agreement is only signed by them.
Not you or the Caring Society. Okay.
No. We were actually asked at one point to join a class action. And I said, no. I said, that's not our role. Our role is really to try and get justice for these kids, to stop the discrimination. Class actions, there's lots of people out there that can do that. And so that's a totally separate thing. But where they start to combine is because the class action means it's going to change some of the tribunal's orders. They came back over to the tribunal and they said, Tribunal, you should accept our final settlement agreement and get rid of basically replace your orders with our agreement. And we said, hold on here a minute. There's some good things about this thing. But there's some folks being left behind. And we want to just bring your attention, Tribunal, that there's folks being left behind and give the class action folks a chance to fix that.
This may seem like a simple question, but can't they do both? Can't they say, hey, as part of this settlement, all of these people who are awarded their compensation, which we promised would be a bare minimum, couldn't they get that? And still have this settlement agreement to deal with it, like everything else, including long-term reform and, other issues, pay them more, like the government said, especially if they had long-term issues. Can't you do both?
Yeah, you can. And one of the things why I think Canada is trying to do here is under the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, when you get Canadian Human Rights Tribunal compensation, you also retain the right as a person who is harmed to go after them for more money in the courts. But under a class action, what they do is they waive that right. So I think what Canada is trying to do is say, well, we don't know how many people we actually hurt, and we don't want all these people coming out of the woodwork, and who knows how much we owe under the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. So under the class action, they could try and cap that out at a specific amount, that being 20 billion. I think that's one of the factors that may have gone into their thinking.
Well, and Canada and Justice Canada, they're always thinking about how to limit liability. Yeah. So if this happens the way we're worried it would happen, not only would they be taking that compensation away as a minimum floor, like that they already wanted, but they could also be taking away their right to go to court later if they want to, if they need to, if you know the things suggest. So it's more things being potentially at risk, and neither one of those things have to happen, right?
No, like, I mean, it's like, in my view, this is what I've always felt, is Canada's a repeat offender. Let's not forget about that, right? Residential schools, and then the survivors told their truth through their tears so their grandchildren would go through it. Canada got up and apologized and compensated. Then we have the 60 scoop. They do it again, same thing. And now I'm thinking, like, they have not changed their behavior. That's what resulted in the harms to these kids. So they should be paying more, because that's what's going to take for them to learn a lesson and not hurt another generation of children. And as we were talking earlier, the harms from generation to generation get harder to deal with for families. So, I think that needs to be recognized in the compensation amount. Canada's just choosing to say, we want to deal with it over here, instead of doing the yes-and solution, which is, I think, the human solution, the most kind and loving solution, and the most just solution.
Because 40,000 is nothing. If you look at, I mean, I don't do civil litigation, but I keep up to date on the kinds of compensation that people are awarded. So 40,000 is nothing. Canada, like you said, could say, okay, you get your compensation, and if you want to be part of this settlement agreement,
I
don't see what's wrong with that, especially in cases where, it even hurts me to say this, but we're not just talking about living children and families.
No, we're not.
We're talking about kids who, because of Canada's discrimination, passed away. Yeah. And that's really serious business. So these are the last people we should be taking anything from.
Yeah. And, you just look across and you look at some of these other big settlements that Canada has made. And they're way north of $40,000. Like, I just think, a childhood's worth so much more than that. You only get one childhood. And I don't think that Canada, it's not that child's problem that Canada hurts so many people, and that number gets so big, right? It's that child's experience needs to be honored with proper compensation for them, and also the important part for all of these people is they went through this suffering and they want it to stop for the next generation of kids. And that's where that long-term reform piece comes into.
Both of those pieces are just so important, because if Canada just keeps settling, it reminds me of certain organizations. I won't mention them tonight, but they get sued by a group of people because they're, engaged in harassment or things, discrimination. They settle the claim, and then they're sued 10 years later, and then 10 years later, because the problem never stops. They've never taken steps to do the long-term reform. They're just going to keep paying out compensation. And so you're knowingly hurting people in the future. And that's what we don't want for any of these kids, including the ones that are going to be born in the future. Now, Jen asked, and I think we already answered it, but Jen asked if there's any chance at all that kids and family might not receive their compensation order under the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal if this settlement gets adopted.
For some families, it will. And I also should say, Canada has appealed the tribunal's compensation orders to the Federal Court of Appeal. So it's got this appeal hanging over that as a place. Right. So Canada basically is trying to kind of keep all its eggs in a basket, and as much as possible have control over what it pays or how it pays or if it pays. So nothing is for sure right now on any of those fronts. What we do have under the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal is 2 legal orders saying that these people are entitled to $40,000. That is for sure. But there are higher levels of court that, Pam, your full-time life is in law. Those higher levels of courts could potentially overturn it. I don't think they would, the whole agreement, but it's a possibility.
Let's hope not. Let's hope that the integrity of Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders are always respected, always implemented, because that's the whole purpose of the Canadian
Yeah.
Human Rights Tribunal. And it doesn't say much for human rights and our commitment to human rights if they're, optional. We can or cannot fulfill these compensation orders, or we can or cannot change them. And I don't think that's good for the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, for human rights in general, for First Nations. I don't think it's a really good precedent to set.
Yeah, we're worried about that too. And especially because there's other First Nations cases, one on policing, special education. And we don't want to have final orders from the tribunal that Canada is supposed to follow through on. And then all of a sudden they go back, oh, well, we want to change it. That's not the way the system is supposed to work. And I just want to say thank you to the tribunal and all, because I think that process has really led to life-changing results for a lot of kids and families through Jordan's principle and through the family prevention services you're finally rolling out there. But we don't want to create more loopholes to get undermine those orders and undermine the services and help families are getting.
Basically, we shouldn't allow human rights to be optional.
No.
If it's convenient or not. And, I had an interesting, and I think we just answered this question, but there was a lawyer who didn't want to be named, not even his first name, but he wanted to know if his reading of all of because on your website, you post all of the documents, that go to court. So your submissions, Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, AFN, everybody.
Yeah.
And so this lawyer is saying he wants to know if his reading of the settlement agreement is correct. He thinks, and we just talked about this, that there could be actually a large number of First Nations children who are already awarded compensation who will be excluded, not get any compensation if approved. Not just that they'll get stuff under the settlement agreement, but some that might not get anything. And he just wants to know, am I reading that right? And he said, if I'm reading this right, wouldn't that be literally like stealing money out of the pockets of the most vulnerable children in this country?
Yeah, we read it very similarly. There are a group of children in care who are excluded from that final settlement agreement. And those are kids who are had to be moved from their families during a child welfare investigation. But maybe they stated that, they have a friend and their mom agreed to take him in, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That's actually the most frequent type of a placement that happens in child welfare. And that's what we want to encourage, right? Is kind of like these more kind of informal arrangements. That's what we traditionally had.
Yeah.
So it's those kids who are not in federally funded placements, but they were moved from their families because their families didn't get the help that they should have gotten from the federal government. That's a group that if this class action doesn't get changed, that group will not be included. And there are also as I said, the estates of parents who died. Those right now, both those groups, in our view, are entitled to $40,000 under the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal's orders. And that's why we're standing up for that at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. And the tribunal's got to make a difficult choice right now. And you can imagine what position they're in. Wow. I mean, they really want to honor the fact that there's more people in here, more than what they could give. Some people will get more. But on the other side, there are these kids who'll get nothing, and the estates of parents. And one of the things we fought for states for is, like Pam, like one of the biggest injustices out there still is those children in unmarked graves. When the residential school settlement happened, they got nothing. Like their states got no recognition. They had the worst case scenario and nothing, no compensation for those kids. And we wanted these parents' estates to be compensated because we knew the money would go to the kids, right? It's like, that's the way it works. And so we wanted, it was another level of support from a family member, from a parent who wasn't able to give, be with their child as long as they'd like to. It would be a small gift from them. And that's what we fought for it. And that's why we're standing up for it still.
Well, it just seems like a matter of fairness and empathy and compassion for people who, because of the discrimination, didn't even survive the discrimination. And you know what? I'm going to skip ahead to Angel's question because she's asking this. She says, What happens to the children or parents who died before the compensation order is actually paid out, if it's paid out? She said, will the compensation be paid to their estates, just like compensation for Native veterans who were so terribly treated were paid to their estates?
Right. So under the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders, the estates of all of the parents, eligible parents, and eligible children are all paid out as long as you're within the timeframes of the discrimination, 2006 to roughly 2017. Under the class action, it's different. It's after the courts kind of agree with this thing, then the clock starts ticking. And so if you die after that, and before the payments are actually made, then yes, your estate will be compensated. But my understanding of it, and I'm not a class action lawyer, so double check this, but my understanding of it is nobody before that would get it.
Oh, well,
under the parents, the children will, but not the parents.
Okay. Now here's one, and it could be just, rumors start based on misinformation or or most of the time, not enough information. Like how many of us have enough information to understand what's going on, what the implications are, who's in, who's out. That's why we're having this session.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lady named Stephanie, and she was told by one of her band counselors that the AFN is making arguments before the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal that, and she said FPIC, but FPIC means free, prior, and informed consent, should not apply in a settlement context. And she says, that's not true, isn't it? Doesn't UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which has the FPIC standard, doesn't that have to be enforced? She wants to know what's happening before she agrees to anything. And so, like, is that addressed in there at all? Because when I was reading the submissions, and not everybody has, but it looks like AFN's arguing that FPIC, or free, prior, and informed consent, does not apply in this context. It doesn't apply to settlements, and they don't feel any obligation to have to consult with First Nations. And I'm thinking, that doesn't sound right to me.
Yeah, like this is, I'm not an expert in this area. But I will tell you, if there's one area where I think Indigenous people should have consent, it's over their own kids.
Yeah.
I mean, Pam, like if we would have had consent over our own kids, they wouldn't have gone to residential schools. They would, this is to me one of the key areas, and it's recognized in laws, right? Like even in the Western laws, right? About the role of parents. Like you get to sign off on your kid going to the field trip for a reason, right? That's kind of that informed consent. And so we need to make sure that that is honored for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children. I have never read free, prior, and informed consent narrowly to apply to lands and resources.
No.
That's not the way that I've interpreted it. Has been not the way that I've tried to uphold the obligations as I feel them. It's always been like, especially with children, the children are the most sacred of everything, right? I don't mean to be brash here, but without the children, the land doesn't really matter, right?
Who will be here to?
Yeah, who will be here? Like, I mean, they're the ones that are going to continue all of the teachings and all of the customs and all those traditions and all the languages. So for me, free, prior, and informed consent applies especially to children. And that's the type of thing we've been trying to say to the tribunal.
Yeah.
I think what we are seeing on the other side is that, well, we struck agreement with Canada, and that's not subject to free, prior, and informed consent, is the way I read their submissions. But you can go read them too on fnwitness.ca on that hotline, and then take them to the legal people and the leadership in your community, and see what you think.
Exactly. And I know, like, from my perspective, if you look at all the court cases that talk about how First Nations chiefs and counselors, because they're in a position of power and decision making, and they make decisions that could impact their band membership, they not only act in a fiduciary, so they have to act in their best interests, but they also have to consent or consult with them and get their consent on a large number of issues. It could be lands, it could be treaties, it could be, so if you apply that to the AFN's not a rights holder, they're not a government, but they seem to be empowered to be making decisions around a nationwide settlement. And so if that's the case, I personally would think they're acting in a fiduciary obligation and they're making decisions that could impact the lives of so many people. I would think that at a bare minimum, there should be free, prior, and informed consent. But and I don't know if you have actually seen these resolutions, but the other thing that I've given a lot of thought to is, because the AFN's not a government, they're not mandated to make decisions on treaties or lands or anything else, and they shouldn't on children. I noticed in their submissions, they're saying they have the support of a number of First Nation regions, but not all of them. So that would suggest to me that you need to go back to the table, inform these First Nations and give them the information they need and see if they're going to consent to this. Because I have a resolution here from the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and it's directly about this Canadian Human Rights Tribunal case and the $40,000 compensation. And so they passed this at one of their meetings. It's resolution number 67 from 2022. And what they're saying is that be it resolved that the implementation that the final agreement, this final agreement we've been talking about, this settlement agreement, must protect the benefits for children, youth, and families, as well as First Nations and First Nation agency service providers arising from that Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision. And any of those orders, like the compensation, has to be a minimum standard. So if there's any chance at all that a First Nation child or family would not get the minimum standard in the settlement agreement, that would seem to me that they would have to change that to respect this resolution. And it's not just the Union of BC Indians. I also see from BC AFN, so BC Assembly of First Nations, saying the exact same thing. That they need to be consulted because they haven't been consulted. They haven't given their free, prior, and informed consent. And they're also saying that the AFN and Canada is not authorized to modify the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal compensation order without the free, prior, and informed consent of all the First Nations in British Columbia, and that the order will be a minimum standard. You've got the First Nations Summit in BC basically making the same kind of resolution. And we don't see, like when the AFN mentioned in their submissions that they have the support of Chiefs of Ontario, Anishinaabe Nation, they don't say, well, we have the support and resolutions from the Atlantic region or from the Alberta region or from like any of these other regions they haven't spoken to. So, and there was a person in here, I'm pretty sure there was someone who asked about, yes. So there was someone who asked about, what about all the First Nations that are not a part of the Assembly of First Nations? Because over the last 10 years, a number have withdrawn for lots of different political reasons. How are we what is the standard that we're going to use to make sure that all First Nations have free, prior, and informed consent on something so massive? And what about those that say we don't agree with your settlement agreement? So, I mean, that's not a question for you or I to answer because we're not at the AFN, but it definitely raises questions about the standard we're going to enact amongst ourselves. We say Canada and the provinces or any other institution has to at least respect free, prior, and informed consent. And you would think that as amongst us as First Nations, we would do the same thing on something so massive and so critical.
Yeah. And the way I look at it is it's one thing if we're giving people something, but it's there's a real, the obligation becomes much more serious and important when you're taking things away.
Yeah.
And the Gitxsan Assembly back in, I think, 2017, 2018, they actually passed a resolution saying go for the 40. So that's already there. So that was there. And there's never been a resolution passed, okay, you can go for less or whatever. So that was the standard that we kind of base this whole thing on.
Mhm.
And then, yeah, more recently, people have been coming forward and saying, hey,
Yeah.
like we have some concerns here. Like we've got children and families, and we want to make sure this is a minimum standard. And that's really what these orders should be. They should be the floor.
The
They shouldn't be
minimum.
the ceiling for any of this stuff, right?
And it's so small. It just seems, all of this seems very basic. It's such a minute award compared to other
Yeah.
settlements.
Yeah.
It's the right thing to do. It's ordered. You're supposed to do it. It's been upheld at the federal court. Just pay it out and continue on with your settlement. And these can join or not. It's like both, not or.
Yeah.
Now there's obviously, on Facebook, there's always rumors going around. And so I think it's, Rob says he wanted to clarify some of the rumors going around, that you personally, Cindy, are going to get millions of dollars from both the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal and this settlement agreement. That cannot be the case.
I am getting zero. And let me tell you why. But, like this is a legitimate question. I really thank him for kind of bringing this forward. Like people should be asking these questions, right?
Yeah.
So under the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, actually no one other than the victims gets money. And so, that's the way it should be. There's no, like everybody hears about the legal fees and lawyers getting a lot of money. Under the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, there's nothing, no legal fees or anything else like this. It's you just right to the victim.
Good.
But when you get into a class action, which is what we're not a part of it. I haven't signed it. We're not going to sign it.
Yeah.
Those lawyers will get compensated for their legal fees. And in similar types of sizes of class action, that it's likely going to be in the neighborhood of $50 million. That will be approved by the federal court, and that would be paid to the lawyers as part of the class action stuff. We don't know for sure what that amount is, but similar class actions, that's the size of it. So, the question of like who gets money for kind of trying to stand up for kids' rights. And I'll say it, like I think if you do some of the work, you probably should get compensated as a lawyer. But I didn't want any part of that. And I really feel like the Caring Society, a lot of people don't know, we don't have any ongoing funding agreements with Canada. The only money we get from Canada is when they're court ordered to do stuff for us. And this compensation stuff we're doing is actually costing us money because we're arguing against Canada. So we're using our own money from my keynotes and everything else like this to pay for this litigation and stand up for these kids left behind. But I really want to thank this person for asking that question.
Yeah.
I know you feel awkward. Well, should I say it? But I mean, this is a really important question to ask because what we want adults to be acting in the best interest of kids. Yeah. And let's face it, sometimes there's other interests on the table. And those are important questions to ask. And I'm glad that you did.
Me too. And, I'm with you. We're hesitant to ask those questions. But, I think that if we were all accountable, we would know all of these things.
Yeah.
Like there would be summary sheets saying, this is person getting this, and this is getting this, and this is getting this. And who knows, right? It's because of the lack of information. We don't know. Yeah. But I always knew that you didn't get any compensation, and your lawyers don't get any compensations out of that either. So you have a phenomenal team who have been working on this forever. Like, thank you to them for doing amazing work and knowing that they're not going to get money out of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. It goes all to the kids and families. And I think that we really need to rethink settlements and the amount of money that goes to lawyers, because there's a difference between your hourly fee and known as a contingency fee, where you just get these exorbitant amounts. And we know the problems that happened with the past Indian residential school settlement and those kinds of things. And we don't want that here.
No, and I think that there needs to be like this is kind of a side topic, but I think whenever you've got skin in a game as an adult in somebody else's thing, I think that has to be really clearly declared. So if I was going out there, if you have a lawyer who's actually going to financially benefit by that agreement being signed off and approved by the courts, Well, when they're out there talking to people, they should say, hey, you know, just FYI,
Yeah.
this is part of my disclosure to you. I want to be honest about that. That just brings all kinds of integrity to the process. But
Yeah.
if all this stuff is happening behind the scenes, that really gets in the way. And I think that I think it's really important that all of us be accountable, because this really is about honoring the victims and honoring their families. And so,
especially in things like this. Like,
yeah.
I think of all of the, there were some cases where lawyers were charging residential school survivors exorbitant
Oh,
fees
yeah.
just to apply for their own award. And I'm thinking, gosh, I hope that would not happen in this case. It's anyway, I'm glad that he raised it.
Yeah, me too.
Because it is about accountability and honesty,
Yeah.
and you literally post everything on your
Yeah.
website. So I think that's also helpful.
Yeah, like I really want everyone to go and read the documents, right? You'll be able to kind of see everything.
So yeah, and there was another question from Ryan who's basically asking the same thing.
Yeah.
Who besides the children and families get the money from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal? And then he said, who aside from the children and families get money from the AFN-Canada agreement? So you've just clarified no one but the kids and families get it from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, but lawyers, and I don't know if they've hired experts or whatever else. So we don't know because we just don't have that information yet. So can't truly answer that in total, Ryan, but hopefully that information will be there soon.
And my understanding, Pam, is that when the class actions go ahead and they actually have to, then the lawyers file something with the federal court saying, we want to be paid this amount. I think that's the way it works. So one of the things that you can do is actually go and when this thing goes to federal court is actually look at how much they're asking for, because it has to be approved by the federal court. That's my understanding of it.
Yep.
I'm learning as I'm going along, but we'll all be able to see what it looks like when that happens.
Well, it's funny because I'm a lawyer, but lawyers practice in such specific areas, civil litigation or tax court or whatever. And it's like, so I don't know these policies and procedures of civil litigation, not to that extent. So I'll be looking for that for sure. Now, Ben has a bunch of questions and I think we already answered them, but he, and if we can't answer some of them, that's okay. So he wanted to know, does AFN have authority from the chiefs in assembly to sign on to this settlement agreement and not have the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal order? And I think you already said that the AFN has a resolution to not go below the 40 or something.
It was actually a resolution to go for the 40.
Oh, so go for the 40. Okay. So that's really the only resolution they have on it, right?
That's my understanding. I don't know of a resolution giving authority to file the class action or to sign the final settlement agreement.
Okay. And his other question was, what does the BC AFN, because he's from BC, have to say about this? But I've already read out the resolutions. And what I can do also is post links to these resolutions below. So, and if you just go to the First Nation Caring website, you'll be able to see all this. Have the First Nations chiefs in assembly, like at the AFN, had a chance to review this settlement agreement in assembly, have their questions answered, and passed a resolution saying we support this settlement agreement before it was signed?
Okay, so the answer to that is not before it was signed. So it was signed, as best as I can remember, on June 30th of this year. And the Chiefs in Assembly met, I think, July 4th to 6th. I got that right?
I think so.
Somewhere like about a week later. But the agreement had already been signed. So there were information sessions, but there was no resolution from the chiefs. And even if a resolution had been asked for, it had already been signed. So that's my understanding of what happened there.
Okay, so that really goes back to these other resolutions saying you didn't get our consent, from the different BC First Nations. Okay, so that's something that AFN and these First Nations are going to have to deal with.
Yeah. There was, however, and we saw this in the filings at the tribunal, and I just want to be totally fair. So there was a resolution passed by the regional chiefs in favor of filing the class action, but not by the Gitxsan Assembly. So the regional chiefs, as you know, Pam, every region, the chiefs have a regional chief for AFN. They go to executive. So there is that.
And so for anyone who doesn't know, the regional chiefs are the executive of the AFN.
Yeah.
So it's still the AFN. That's the decision-making body. So the AFN approved the settlement for AFN, as opposed to like First Nation Summit or BCAFN or some of these other ones. But I understand they do have this specific resolutions and support from the Chiefs of Ontario and Anishinaabe Nation for sure, because I saw that in the submissions. And then the question is asked, what about that? His last one is, what about First Nations who have withdrawn from the AFN over the years? Are they consulted with separately, or do they have to approve separately? Like, I don't know what AFN is going to do or has done about that. I'm not sure if you do.
No, we actually asked this question as part of the cross-examination. So if you go on to our cross-examination of AFN's affiant, Janice, I really apologize. I can't pronounce her name properly. She's the CEO of AFN. She swore an affidavit. And we asked about, what about those First Nations that may not be members of the Assembly of First Nations? And there was, I think, a response back that it was just a handful of them. And I'm not sure what the process is around these types of national issues that could affect those nations who have chosen to withdraw. So that's kind of above my pay grade and above my expertise. So
I don't know either, but it's definitely a good question.
Yeah, it's an excellent question.
Okay, so let's see what else. Dawn had several questions. Wait, I think it's just a couple. Yeah. Will the First Nations women and mothers be given time to review the agreement separately in order to consent or not? I don't know. I haven't seen that there's a Indigenous or First Nation women specific process. And because she's saying that the AFN has no governing power to make decisions over our children. And the National Inquiry into Murder to Mish thing said from this point forward, Native women have to be considered specially and only they can make decisions on their behalf. So I think she's raising a good point. But again, I don't know if they're going to negotiate with First Nation women separately or mothers who've been impacted separately. I think it's a good idea, but I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't know that either. But there is the AFN does have a website about the class action, and you can call them up and ask them these good questions too, right? And I really recommend that people do and share ideas, right, about how to do this right. Because again, we come back to the thing about, it takes a community to help children and raise a child. Well, that's why good ideas like that can come forward.
Oh my gosh, yes. And I think our last question here that I got from all of the social media today, and then I'll look at some of the comments. And this is from Kim. And Kim is asking, what about all of the First Nations women and men who are in federal and provincial prisons who have been impacted by the child welfare system themselves, or their kids have, because of the over-incarceration of themselves in prison, and then they have their kids taken away? Is there a special process to engage with them? And she says, as part B, what about the homeless? What about those living in shelters? What about the most vulnerable of First Nations? Is there a process for them? And I don't know. I wish I knew. I think all of that should happen. I agree. If it was my decision, I'd say, you bet we're going to talk to those people. But I'm not there, so I don't know. Do you know anything about that?
Well, in the CHRT compensation, we actually identified a lot of these people who have got very different circumstances, and they require different types of supports. So that was identified as a to-do for the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal compensation, the order that they made, because they made an order, not only the amounts, but how the money should flow. Under the class action, I mean, I know that's on their radar. I don't know any specifics about how they're going to do it. And one of the things I should probably clarify, because it comes up a lot, Pam, is people will say, well, my child was taken into care by the province. Are they eligible for this compensation?
Right.
And the answer to that is no, because it's about on reserve because of the federal funding and for Jordan's principle. So, but there are class actions that are moving along for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children off reserve who are in the child welfare system. So that process is underway, yeah. And you know, I'm just trying to think about what the case title is, but there's there's a class action. Maybe I can send you the link later.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that way, if folks are off reserve, you know that there's a process out there for you.
Oh, thank goodness. Because when they did the settlement for Indian residential schools, my first thought was, but what about the day schools? Like,
Yeah.
what about the day schools? There was similar harms there. And so they had to have a separate, class action for that. And I'm just thinking, okay, in this case, you've got the federal, then there'll be all the provincial circumstances. I just hope people don't fall through the cracks in all of this, kind of like, it just reminds me of Bill C-92, the First Nation Child Welfare Act, this distinctions-based approach, and how many urban kids or rural or remote kids could actually fall through the cracks because their local community's not there. And, so I just hope none of that happens. These are all phenomenal questions.
They're great
And I think it's always better to ask questions than rely on someone's just casual, oh, I heard a rumor, or here I think what's happening. Now I'm going to, if you have a couple of minutes, I'd like to go through some of the questions that are on YouTube as well.
Oh yeah, let's do it. And
Okay.
I also posted that link to that the class action off reserve.
Oh, yes, for sure. So Rila says, is there anything to be said about the increased funding resulting in new services on reserve that now are seeing higher numbers of parents now involved with child welfare? I'm not aware of that, if that's just First Nation specific, but I think what she's asking, because there's a follow-up here, is that there's been a sharp increase of people in the child welfare system. And she thinks it might be tied to funding and increased services. So I'm not really sure about that. Do you know anything about that?
So under the tribunal was ordered, or the tribunal ordered Canada to provide funding for support services for families so that they could, they have the best chance of safely caring for their kid at home. But Canada didn't do that back in 2016. So those monies were one of those non-compliance orders we talked about, Pam, and it just started rolling in about 2019. So when we look at the child and care data, we got to give a shout out. I know that, doing child welfare is a hard job, but First Nations folks who are doing it, they're actually far more likely to keep kids in their families than the provinces or territories mainstream child welfare is. So even during the worst stages, more kids were staying with families on reserve than off reserve. We have not seen an increase as a result of the prevention services because they're just starting to roll out now. So we need to look at the data, but what you're pointing to is a really important question. How do we make sure these services make a difference for kids and families? And we do have an answer for that, or at least part of one. And that is to make sure that we're capturing what's happening to children and families at a community level. So we can say, well, this is the way that everything is today, but you know what? We dream a better future for our kids, and this is the way we want to see them. So let's track and make sure what we're doing is making a difference. And if it isn't making a difference, then let's change things up so that it can make a difference, right? Because that's the bottom line: is we gotta do the right thing, right? Instead of hanging on to, this idea is the best idea and we're never going to change it.
I know.
That doesn't happen. So you're right on the ball, but we've not seen data about children in care rising since the prevention money came in.
Okay. Georgia says, thank you both for being modern day superheroes, heart. Thank you for that, Georgia.
Yeah. And you know what? Like, I just get so inspired going out to communities. I know you do too, Pam. Like, we meet superheroes every single day, right?
Yeah.
In the communities, people are really stepping up to the plate, doing amazing things. Like I met foster mom, First Nations foster mom, and looked after like so many kids. And she has a table for, 12-foot table, which she brings all the kids who need to feel love. They just come around that table. Like people like that are out there, right?
Yeah. There is good too. There is good too, like in our communities, like I think of all the grannies that I've known in my life who end up having 12 kids, not even their own. It could be some of their grandkids, their neighbors' kids, some kid who just got dropped off, and they do their best to take care, but they don't get any support for it. So they have all these kids and they don't get supports.
And, this would be a good time for us to really honor another superhero that I know is close to both Pam and I, and that is Jordan River Anderson, the founder of Jordan's Principle. Do you know, Pam, tomorrow would be his 23rd birthday? So I just asked people, it was named in memory of Jordan River Anderson. His family gave us this great sacred gift and obligation. I would just ask people, in whatever way that you pray or do ceremony tomorrow, that you think of Jordan River Anderson and his family on that very special day.
Yeah, because now, we have Jordan's Principle, and he didn't get to benefit from it, but now, hopefully we'll have, the criteria and all of the good changes and everything be fair. And I can't believe 23. I feel like, time goes by so fast, but I think it's important too, Cindy, that we don't ever forget the people who did this, the people who had so much, inspired us all, kind of like Shannon Kustasian,
Yeah, there's another one. And, one of the things I'd ask folks listening up is, I know sometimes we all have nicknames for each other, right? And I hear some people call Jordan's Principle JP, but I would really ask that we'd say the full name. Like Jordan, his gift has touched the lives of so many children and families. And it hasn't been often big things that Jordan's Principle funds, but it's life-changing.
Yes.
Like being able to kind of buy formula for your baby, being able to give your child who may have, different abilities, the supports they need to truly flourish in the way that they are. Like these aren't big ticket items, but they are life-changing for these children. And it's thanks to Jordan and his family and the community of Norway House. We all got to lift those folks up.
Oh my goodness. And for anyone who hasn't heard Cindy and I's previous conversations on my podcast about some of the literal horror stories that Canada would deny treatment for such significant things, life-altering things, it's just, you can't imagine that a country like Canada would do that. So Jordan's Principle is so important, and glad we're talking about him too. Victoria has a question. Cindy, do you feel that there should have been camera for your court case so Indigenous communities could have followed your trial? And there wasn't there?
There was. Thank you, Victoria. You and I are on the same page. I absolutely 100% agree with you. And this is where we need to do a major shout out to APTN.
Yes.
Yeah, because APTN covered the main trial, which was 72 days.
Wow.
Gavel to gavel. And then they have also they live streamed this recent hearing on compensation. They've been so great at making sure that wherever you are, that you can watch. And that way you don't even have to rely on my take on things, right? You can say, well, Cindy's biased because she's a party. Fair enough. Well, go watch it yourself, right? Read the documents yourself. I think it's so important. Like I've always thought, like, these are not my children. They're other people's children. And they have every right to watch what we're doing, hold us accountable for what we're doing and for what we're saying. So you can go and check out the live stream from APTN on the compensation hearings. And whenever possible, certainly we're always advocating for everything to be filmed.
Yeah, well, and that's the whole thing. It's accountability. So Canada, if you're going to make terrible, embarrassing, shameful arguments that you don't have any obligations to First Nations kids in care, then you need to say that in front of everybody, like to be held accountable, because up until now, really, it's only been a more recent thing. Canada could make all these terrible claims in court about everything. Oh, you don't have treaty rights, you don't have land rights, and people didn't actually hear about it unless you're a lawyer and you study it. So it's almost like they weren't held to account, but you've made sure, and APTN, I just love APTN for doing that, to make sure that anybody can watch.
And also Elenisa Bomsawin, now there's the superhero, right? Those of you who maybe not know her, she's Abenaki, National Film Board, a documentary filmmaker, sculptor, just person extraordinaire. And she actually had her cameras along with APTN in these hearing rooms. And so you can watch a documentary about the main trial called We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice, free on the the National Film Board website. And also Jordan River Anderson, The Messenger, free on the NFB website. And you mentioned Shannon Kustachin,
Yes.
the amazing Shannon Kustachin from Attawapiskat First Nation, who founded Shannon's Dream. And you can watch her story in another one of Elenice's documentaries, Hi Ho, Mr. Hay. Now you might be saying to yourself, wow, this person's done quite a bit for their career.
Oh.
Well, that's only one of, I don't know how many she's had, over 50 documentaries. Yeah.
About all important things, you know? Yeah. Oh my goodness. And I was actually at Imaginative last night because we were, talking about our podcast and I saw her just as I was going in because I had to do a presentation on the podcast at Imaginative and she was walking by and I just wanted to go, wait, I want to talk to you. But I had to go in. Just every time I see her, I think, she has fought racism, institutional racism, I'm sure sexism. Like she's been doing this forever, but she just kept going to make sure that our voices was heard. Like she is a superhero to me. I love her. And she's just got such a big heart.
Yeah. So if you're tired of whatever's on your TV, go check out these, right?
Exactly. Dark Native. Oh, hey, Dark Native, probably from my Twitch stream. Is the Jordan's principle actually implemented and effective now? I understand that some people have had to deal with delays.
Yeah, there are some delays, but we're so much further ahead than we were before. Oh, okay. So now First Nations children on and off reserve are eligible for Jordan's principle. And if you're off reserve, you don't have to have status. If your community recognizes you, you can get help for your child under Jordan's principle. That's really important for everyone to listen to because so often it's status or non-status, that colonial stuff. So if your community knows who you are and says, yep, you can get help for your kid. And where we're seeing some problems, though, is in the implementation of timelines. Like they're supposed to be able to determine these cases within 48 hours for individual children. And they're doing that in some cases, but there's still some problems. So we're doing what we can to make sure that those problems get solved so that it's less red tape for families and more time just doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is loving their kids.
Yeah, exactly. That's all we want. Same kind of social programs and opportunities and health, safety, and well-being as everybody else. So thanks, Dark Native. I think that was an important question because
it is. And, I should say that, sometimes we get focused in on all the kind of, what we still have to do. Yeah. But in Jordan's, just to really honor Jordan and his birthday tomorrow, there's been about 1.5 million different services given to kids that otherwise wouldn't have been, thanks to Jordan's principles. So we got to make sure that we build on that and we keep on, strongly supporting Jordan's principles so that number continues to grow. But the difference that Jordan's principles made in the lives of kids is just extraordinary.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And when you think about just how many services, imagine all of that was denied.
Like, all of it would have been denied. There were 0 Jordan's principle cases is what the Fed said. Like, what Pat was saying is true. Like they would cap the number of feeding tubes for kids. Like it was barbaric. And this was not ancient history. No. This is stuff that was going down, prior to the tribunal making its decision in 2016.
Oh, thank you, Jordan River Anderson. That's pretty amazing. And Rila says, I got some very powerful information and good reminders from this broadcast, Miigwech. Well, thank you too for joining and taking the time to actually hear some of the facts.
And some of these amazing questions, like these are fabulous questions. And, maybe one of the things we should do is kind of find a kind of a expert in class action law, one of those legal gurus and get some of the legal questions answered here for folks because, they're really important.
Yeah. And like some kind of fact sheet or something.
Yeah.
Charity says, excellent source of information for what's really going on with First Nations in Canada. Thank you. I mean, that's why I brought Cindy here, because if there's anyone who knows everything but maybe the most technical of legal questions. She's been at this forever, and she's the one I go to, in fact, for it's like, wait a second, does it say this? What's going on? What's happening? I know Cindy's always going to be there to answer the questions.
Well, and the podcast, got to check it out. And Pam's Warrior Kids.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Warrior Kids for kids who want to know. Dark Native says, good to hear this, Cindy. Yako, for your answer. And I just posted Cindy's link. Okay. Is this the class action suit for the provincial child welfare?
Yeah, that's for the provincial child welfare. And I'll actually do the one where the site for AFN here, where folks can get a hold of them. And let's just see here, I think AFN class action.
Yeah, because all these resources are so important.
Yeah, and it really, because sometimes you're going on the internet and you're trying to figure this stuff out, and it's just
there's so much on the internet, right?
Yeah,
you don't even know what's true anymore.
Well, that's the thing, right? I mean, it is pretty scary sometimes. You get out there, you think, remember in the old days, like, it's just dating myself, but remember when all that kind of misinformation was basically in those tabloids near the grocery
store or something?
Yeah, but now, like, I mean, it's in a lot of places, and so we have to always go to trusted sources all the time.
Oh my gosh! Right? Even like the purposeful misinformation sites, they can set up websites that actually look like a news site. And so when you're going through, unless you do some checking, it's really hard to tell. Okay, and so we've got one last question here. Hi, Dr. Cindy. And this is from Victoria. Nice picture of the cat. I wonder if that's your cat. Do you feel there is enough support, solidarity, awareness for Orange Shirt Day in Canada and the United States?
I think we need a lot. I'm going to say something here that just to show the power of the people here. We were litigating on this compensation. Canada, after the discovery of the children in the Grays into Kamloops, they were actually litigating against us in federal court to try and not pay these kids any compensation under the tribunal's orders. And it was the sea of orange shirts. Remember that, Pam, last year? Everybody Canada Day was not wearing red. They were wearing orange.
Yes.
They were saying to the federal government, look, get on these TRC calls to action. And people started reading them, and they realized that the top ones are all about kids today, because the survivors wanted to see things that are better for their grandkids. So in that 6 weeks, we know this from Eva Jewell and Ian Mosby. Check out their Yellowhead ranking of the TRC calls to action. They put it out every year. And they said that within the next 6 weeks, more TRC calls to action were implemented than the previous 6 years.
Yes.
And I'm pretty sure that's that public pressure that forced
the
government to announce the $20 billion for compensation and the $20 billion over 5 years to fix child and family. Without that public pressure. So it shows that what we can do together. And it doesn't take very much. I mean, look at Pam. We're rocking orange, and everybody can do it. And what I would say too is every time you get a chance to vote, wear orange into the voting room.
Yes.
And I got copies of the TRC calls to action and the Murder Missing Indigenous Women and Girls calls to justice. And whenever I get a knock at the door at election time, I always say, "What have you personally done?" Right? And if they don't know what it is, then I tell them to take it home and read it and tell me what they're personally done, because that's what my vote's going to count on.
Oh, that's awesome. And we're getting lots of orange hearts from this, from Georgia and Charity and Victoria. Every Child Matters. So thank you for actually going, way over time. We were going to do an hour, but it's 25 minutes over.
And I should just say one more thing. I'm going to just take one more thing, and that is
I have a question too for you.
Oh. Okay. So some people always say, well, what's going to happen next in this legal business with compensation? So remember I was saying that the class action people in Canada wanted to replace the tribunal's order with their final settlement agreement. So legal papers went back and forward. There was a hearing that APTN broadcast. We think that ruling from the tribunal will be out within the next couple of weeks.
Oh, wow.
And we don't know what they're going to say, but we'll all have to watch for that. So if you go on to fnwitness.ca, or if you follow my Twitter feed at cblackst or at the Caring Society, or you follow Pam, you'll hear about this decision. And then that, whatever that decision is, that will affect what happens with the class action on the long run. So we got to see where that goes.
Okay.
Again, my goal is to, really honor all those folks in the class action or getting more, but making sure that no one's left behind.
Let's just hope that the right decisions are made so that the kids don't get left behind. And thank you, Jackie, for the orange teddy bear. We're
I love
it. Teddy bear theme tonight.
We are. We're always bear themed.
And Wendy, thank you again for another hope-filled podcast. It's just, and I agree here with Dark Native. We must keep pressure on the governments to address the calls to action, wear orange shirts. And, this might be a little bit of a brag, but I think 7 different kinds of orange shirts, and I only get them from First or Indigenous organizations like A7 in Ottawa, for example. So there's lots of grassroots groups that do this to raise money to support this. Don't buy from big corporate institutions or like non-native people on Amazon or anything like that. There's always a way you can look to buy them from Native people, to support Native people, because we're always putting that money back into supporting these amazing causes. But before you go, Cindy, I had a question for you, and I didn't know where to fit it in all of this, but I read a lot of the submissions, not all of them.
Yeah.
But there's 2 things that I read in the AFN submission. One is that you are fighting against the implementation of the settlement agreement. And that doesn't seem accurate. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but you want both the CHRT kids and families to get their compensation and everybody else in the settlement agreement to get their compensation. What you don't want is for kids to be left behind.
That's right. That's right. So like the way I view it is the agreement needs to be fixed to make sure that these people who are left behind are included.
Oh, well, that's good, because sometimes people put things in submissions and people might assume because it's a legal submission that it's fact. And that's just different people's interpretations. But I've never known you to just want to fight against a settlement. You want people to be compensated. Yeah. And the other thing they put in there is that you only represent child welfare agencies. And that was the first time I ever heard that, because all this time, as far as I know, in all of our work together, you have just been advocating for First Nation kids in care and their families, for fairness, non-discrimination. And that's what the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal order was about. I didn't see anything for child welfare agencies in this, the Human Rights Tribunal order.
No, I mean, really what we're about here is, and actually one of the things the Caring Society did is we brought a motion for the tribunal to get prevention funding for First Nations too. It's really about making sure that the children and the families have access to the services from the groups that are in the best position to provide those services. We do work with First Nations agencies, and we got some members on our board, but that's not everything we do. And so, and we certainly have never said we represent anyone. We try to follow the directives of communities through resolutions like the ones that you're talking about, and pay attention to that. But we're really a kind of a service organization. We're not a political national Aboriginal organization or whatever they call them these days. We're not that. We're doing what we can for kids and families.
Yeah, that's what I thought all along. But again, I thought I better ask that because that just came up on Facebook. And I was like, well, I don't want that going around, that you only represent child welfare agencies, that you're in fact trying to advocate for First Nation kids in care and their families, and for all of the, any group, First Nation group or agency group that's actually trying to do that work, and they're underfunded, chronically underfunded, underpaid, less capacity. And I just wanted to make sure that was clarified. Cindy, is there anything else that we forgot to talk about tonight? Those were all the questions that I got. We got some questions from the live session. Is there anything we forgot?
No, I think that those questions were amazing, and everyone. This is like Friday night, and I'm sure that people, are kind of thinking, "Wow, I wonder what's on Netflix." And by the way, one thing that is on Netflix is some of you know the amazing Mary T.G. Her and Matt LeMay and have done this film called For Love, which is narrated by Shania Twain.
Yeah.
So anyway, so if you're getting on Netflix, there you can go, or go watch one of Eleniso Bomsawin's amazing documentaries.
Oh my gosh. And
in fact, you can watch Jordan River Anderson, The Messenger, and honor his birthday tomorrow.
Yes, exactly. And for all of you who are here, you're going to know a factoid about For Love documentary because Dr. Cindy Blackstock's in it. But guess who else?
Yes.
Yeah. I have a little clip, just like maybe 30 seconds, but I was like, yes, I'm in this really awesome documentary, talking about this important issue. And it's just, I'm so glad people are taking up these issues more and more and more.
And seeing the strength of the young people, like this isn't just a story about all this horrible stuff. It's like, like these are just amazing young people, and it makes you fall in love with them even more. And then that makes the injustices they're facing even more unacceptable. Like that's really it. So go check it out. For Love. And of course, Jordan River Anderson, The Messenger.
Jules is giving blessings. William's saying important aspects. Dark Native is saying, yay. Thank you, Cindy, for taking so much time on a Friday night. And thank you to all of you who tuned in.
Yeah.
There was different numbers at different times for tuning in, asking questions, offering your support. Go to Cindy's website because there is so much information there. It's called the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. And this is the website address, Caring Society. And if you want to follow Dr. Cindy Blackstock, here is her Twitter address. I mean, you'll just find out everything about everything. That's why I follow her. And she just has so many amazing updates and reports and information. And that's what I like about her. So thank you, everybody. This will be forever on YouTube now, this video for other people to watch. I'll also upload it on my podcast because some people only listen to podcasts because that's their preference. So we're going to have this everywhere. We'll probably share clips of it just to try to get as many people as possible up to date and informed as much as they can. We couldn't answer everything, but I think we got the majority of questions anyway.
Yeah, maybe we'll get a few more experts who, can answer some stuff we don't know, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much, everyone, and have an awesome weekend. Wear your orange shirts all weekend and send messages to government to say, you got to do better. You got to fix that settlement agreement to make sure all kids are included and no one gets left behind. Yeah. Thank you so much, Cindy.
Hey, thank you for having me, Pam. Thanks for all your awesome work. Bye, everybody. Bye.